Lasagna, Garfield's favorite dish of layered pasta stuffed with meaty tomato sauce, ricotta, and mozzarella cheese, right? Well, sometimes. Turns out lasagna is one of the most complicated and varied dishes I've ever researched for this show. And the only way I could figure out how to discuss it was with this, the lasagna family tree. So today I'll show you how to make a medieval lasagna as I tumble down the rabbit hole and explore the genealogy of lasagna, this time on Tasting History. Today is kind of special because I'm getting to pair with the fantastic Chef Frank Proto from his channel, Proto Cooks. You might know Chef Frank for his fantastic 4 levels videos that he does for Epicurious. So on Tasting History today, normal episode talking about the history of lasagna, but then I'm actually going to appear over on Chef Frank's channel afterward to talk about the more recent past of lasagna while he makes his version of an American lasagna. So for today's recipe, we're going to that exact place that you think of when you think of lasagna, medieval England. That's right, we have a recipe for Lausanne in that 14th century cookbook that's become rather perennial on this show, the Forme of Cury. Take good broth and cook in an earthen pot. Take fine white flour and make thereof paste with water. And make thereof foils thin as paper with a roller, dry it hard, and boil it in broth. Take Ruayn cheese, grated, and lay it in a dish with powder douce, and lay thereon the foils large and many as thou might, and above powder and cheese, and so twice or thrice, and serve it forth. So a couple of interesting ingredients in there. First, Ruayn cheese. We don't really know what it was, lots of speculation, but it was probably a semi-soft cheese made during the autumn. I'm going to be using Gouda. It grates well, and I like Gouda, and it would have been available at the time, but you can go ahead and really use whatever cheese you want. Also, the Gouda that I'm using is rather expensive, so I wanted to take this opportunity to doff my, once again, non-existent history cap and thank the Deans of the Larder, my Patreon patrons who help me to afford all of the lavish ingredients that I use here on Tasting History. The second interesting ingredient is powder douce, and in medieval times there were lots of different spice mixtures going around, but the main ones were powder douce and powder four. Powder douce was definitely sweeter, and powder four was more peppery or spicy, what we think of as spicy. And they would have varied depending on who was actually doing the cooking. There wasn't a standard recipe, but I've used some old recipes to kind of come up with my version of powder douce. Now, even though this dish is English and not Italian, I figure it's close enough to Italian that I've decided to open up a bottle of Montepulciano and enjoy a glass of wine while I rattle off the recipe for you. What you'll need is 2 cups of bread flour, 1/2 cup of water, 1.5 quarts or 1.5 liters of meat stock, beef or chicken, 8 ounces of semi-soft cheese, 1 tablespoon of sugar, 2 teaspoons of ginger, 2 teaspoons of cinnamon, 1 teaspoon nutmeg, 1/2 teaspoon grains of paradise. Now you'll notice that even though it's usually considered sweet, I am adding in some grains of paradise into my powder douce, but I am going to listen to that 13th century Franciscan friar Jacopone da Todi when he said, "He who looks at magnitude is often mistaken. A grain of pepper conquers lasagna with its strength." So to give our lasagna a fighting chance, I'm only adding a little bit of grains of paradise. So the first thing to do is to assemble your powder douce by grinding up any of the spices you might have and mixing them together. Then bottle it up and set it aside. Now we make our noodles. So pour your flour out onto a clean work surface and create a bit of a ring, then slowly pour the water and work it into the flour. The consistency is going to be quite different from a modern pasta noodle, which is usually made with semolina flour and egg. This is actually going to be more like an unyeasted bread dough. So once the water is incorporated, get to kneading just as you would if you were making a loaf of bread. About 15 minutes by hand, or about half that long if you're going to use a stand mixer. Then cover it and let it rest for 20 minutes. Once that 20 minutes is over, it's time to roll your noodles. Now, if you don't have a huge space to roll, go ahead and divide the dough in half. That's what I had to do. You could even do it in thirds, but you could also do it in one. It's up to you. Now we want these noodles extremely thin, so once you think you've rolled enough, just keep rolling. Rollin', 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 keep them noodles rollin'. Rollin', 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 lasagna. Now, if you do have a fancy pasta roller, you can go ahead and use it. You'll actually get to see one of those over on Chef Frank's channel when he makes his lasagna, but I did it by hand, like the recipe said. So now that our pasta is rolled, you can go ahead and cut it pretty much to whatever size you want. You can cut it into long strips or even big sheets, or, as one 14th century cookbook recommends, into squares 3 fingers wide. And that's going to be 1, easier to boil, and 2, easier to eat because they didn't use forks in medieval Europe at this point, so it was going to actually be eaten with a stick or with your hands. And a big sheet of pasta is just not gonna be that easy. So once you've cut your pasta, the recipe says to let it dry hard, and that takes about a day. But if you want to make this all in one day, that's okay. Leave it for an hour. It's going to get hard enough because we're going to be boiling it afterward anyway, so not a big deal. Whenever you are ready to boil your pasta, just add your broth to a pot. If you are going to be using an unsalted broth, make sure to add some salt in there, and set it over high heat until you get a rolling boil. Then gently add your pasta and boil for 8 to 12 minutes. The length of time is really going to depend on 1, how thin you rolled your pasta, and 2, how you like your pasta. So if you want it al dente, maybe 8 minutes. If you like it a little looser, maybe 12 minutes. Now as our pasta boils, let us get to a climbing that lasagna family tree. We begin our journey at the bottom, with the roots of etymology. There is debate about even where the term lasagna comes from. One theory is that it comes from the ancient Greek word laganon, meaning long strips of thin pasta. Another theory is that it came from the ancient Greek word lasanon, which meant a trivet, and then in Latin that word was turned into lasanum, which meant more of a full pot, so that could refer maybe to the pot that the pasta was being cooked in. Who knows, you know? Lasanon, laganon, discuss! But as we move up the tree onto the first branch, we find an actual dish that might be a predecessor to our modern-day lasagna. Patinam apiciam sic facies, or patina alla apicius. Yes, that Apicius, who we dealt with in the De Coquinaria episode. There's a recipe in the book that reads a bit like a layered pasta dish, and a bit like what you might find in a middle school sloppy joe. Chicken, fish, turtle dove, sow's udder, or whatever else you can think of. And that's an actual part of the recipe. Whatever else you can think of. So whatever mystery meat you end up finding, you layer that with sauce and herbs and something called laganum, which the 1st century BC poet Horace describes as sheets of dough deep fried in olive oil. But while the construction is lasagna adjacent and there is an ingredient that kind of sounds like lasagna, we really have to move to a totally different branch of the tree before we find a dish that we would recognize as something like lasagna. In the early 14th century, a cook believed to be from Naples contributed a recipe for lasagna to the Liber de Coquina. It's the first recipe where we see cheese introduced, and it's that recipe where I mentioned you cutting the pasta into squares 3 fingers across. Also, it describes eating it with a stick, so you would skewer the pasta and bring it up to your mouth, because they didn't have forks. But that lasagna wouldn't have been super cheesy like we think of when we eat American lasagna today. Instead, it would have been just lightly sprinkled on, and we know that because of the Black Plague. Stay with me. In 1348, Marchione di Copo di Stefano Bonaiuti, imagine having to squeeze that onto one of those "Hello, my name is" name tags. Anyway, he wrote about the mass burials that were happening in Florence at the time. Earth would be taken and thrown down on them, and then others would come on top of them, and then earth on top again, in layers, with very little earth, like garnishing lasagna with cheese. Macabre, but useful for our lasagna recreation today. And that brings us to another 14th century recipe from the Forme of Cury, the one that we're making today. Now, this recipe was made about 70 or 75 years after that first one that I mentioned, so if you ever find on the internet people from England claiming that they made the first lasagna, they're wrong. And you will find it out there, but they're wrong. Moving on, one of the most important cookbooks of all time was written in Rome in the year 1570. While working for the Pope, Bartolomeo Scappi finished his opera, which simply means work, no singing involved. And I will definitely do an entire episode dedicated just to this book, probably multiple episodes, because it is so paramount. But suffice it to say, it typifies Renaissance Italian cooking like none other, especially in its use of lots of spices and lots of sugar together. Scappi's torta lasagna is made with pasta and provatura and Parmesan cheese and butter, and then also has a liberal amount of sugar and pepper and cinnamon. And if you're thinking, well, that's kind of a flavor profile that is a bygone relic of the Renaissance, there's something eaten still today called lasagna da fornel, which is eaten in parts of Veneto around Christmas. It has walnuts and butter and apples, a sweet lasagna. At the end of the Renaissance, there was an ingredient introduced to Italy that would lead to a rebirth of Italian cooking: the tomato. I did an entire episode on the tomato where I made an 18th century Italian tomato dish, so definitely go check that one out. But suffice it to say, it changed the face of Italian cooking forever. No dish more than lasagna. And that brings us to the largest branch on our lasagna family tree, whether tomato-based or not. In Liguria, there is the delicate lasagna verde, which is baked with pesto. And in Marche, they have the rich vincis grassi, which is made with chicken livers and marsala wine and cream and sweetbreads and truffles. Piemonte has lasagna al sangue, made with pork blood. In Sicily, it's lasagna al norma, which is made with roasted eggplant. And taleggio lasagna is made with radicchio, taleggio cheese, and mushrooms, and is still popular today in Treviso. But truly, when it comes to the Jets versus Sharks style lasagna rumble, there are but two contenders. Lasagna alla napoletana, which is served in Naples around Carnevale, and lasagna bolognese al forno, which is served during special occasions in the Emilia-Romagna region of Italy. These two lasagnas cannot agree on anything, even the spelling of lasagna. In the north, they spell it with an E at the end, which is plural and refers, I guess, to the many layers of lasagna. But in the south, they usually spell it just with an A at the end, which refers, I guess, to the singular lasagna as a whole. And those spelling conventions went across the pond because in England, they spell it with an E at the end, and in America, we spell it with an A at the end. Meh. In Naples, it's made with wavy sheets of pasta and is stuffed with ragu and meatballs and ricotta cheese and mozzarella and sometimes hard-boiled eggs just for good measure. Then up in the Emilia-Romagna region, they make it with flat sheets of pasta that are tinted green with spinach, creamy bechamel sauce, meaty bolognese ragu, and lots of Parmigiano Reggiano cheese. Each insists that they are the true Italian lasagna, and countless families have been torn asunder in their constant civil war. Now, regardless of where you stand on this very important debate, it does seem that there is a lasagna for pretty much every occasion, for everyone and everywhere, including places outside of Italy. And we're going to cover those when I talk about that last branch on the lasagna family tree over on Chef Frank Proto's channel, Proto Cooks, where he will show you how to make his version of an American lasagna. Won't you, Chef?
That's right, Max. And I'll teach you how to make a classic Italian-American lasagna like I grew up with. It's got fresh pasta, meat sauce, ricotta, mozzarella, pecorino romano cheese, and a little bit of love. So I'll see you over there.
So I'll put a link in the description to where you can go watch me over on Chef Frank's channel talking about the more recent past of lasagna. But until then, it's time to finish our medieval lasagna. So once your pasta is cooked, pour it into a colander. Then in a dish, whatever size you want, lay out a layer of pasta. Then a thin layer of cheese and a sprinkle of powder douce. Then repeat twice or thrice. I'm going to be doing thrice since I'm using a small bowl, but if you only get twice in there, twice is fine. And there's our lasagna. 14th century English lasagna. Now this lasagna is not baked or anything like that. At least it doesn't mention it. So make sure to put the cheese on and everything while those noodles are still hot, because the cheese is kind of melted, looks pretty good, but I think if they were cold, it wouldn't. Now, as far as eating this, a fork would be great, but as I mentioned, they didn't have forks, so I'm going to be using a stick, like the Liber de Coquina suggests. Let's see how this goes. Stab it. Okay. Like, pry it up. Okay, I'm sure that they had a better way of doing this. This cannot be the recommended method, but actually that's not that bad, except that this is going to be a huge bite. So turn away, please. That's good. Doesn't taste like lasagna. Like, not at all. It tastes more like macaroni and cheese. Like Kraft mac and cheese with cinnamon and sugar. And yeah, it's weird, but I like it. Okay, yeah, it's good. The stick is not maybe the best. I want a fork, but I'm sticking with the stick. I suggest it as more of a curiosity more than anything else. I maybe wouldn't eat a whole bowl full, but as a little appetizer, that might be kind of fun. Yeah. So that is medieval English lasagna. And if you want to learn more about modern lasagna and how to make one, you can join me over on Chef Frank Proto's channel, Proto Cooks. Link is in the description. And I will see you next time on Tasting History.